They mocked the blind Omega and made her sing for amusement, until the Alpha King rose to his feet. In the northern kingdom of Velmora, winter had a way of never leaving. The sun shone weakly across frozen forests, and night stretched endlessly, filled with sharp winds that whispered secrets. In the grand palace of ice and obsidian, the court lived by rules older than the mountains themselves, rules that spoke of power, loyalty, and the ancient bond between alphas and omegas. To be born, an alpha was to command. To be born, an omega was to obey. And to be born neither was to be invisible. Lyra had been invisible all her life. Blind from birth, she had been left at the gates of the palace by a winter storm, swaddled in rags and shivering in the snow. The servants who found her had claimed her as another child for the orphan chambers, a quiet girl with pale eyes that reflected nothing but light itself. She moved through the corridors and halls of the palace like a shadow guided by memory and instinct. She knew where the stones were uneven, where the wind bit through cracks, and where the echoes of footsteps betrayed the approach of nobility. But though she heard everything, she was never seen, never noticed, except when her voice was summoned. The nobles of Velmora, drunk on wine and arrogance, had discovered that Lyra could sing. Her voice was soft, trembling like frost over still water, yet rich with a sorrow they could not understand. They called her the songbird and made her perform during feasts and celebrations. They laughed at her blindness, teasing her as if the world was theirs to bend. But Lyra sang nonetheless. Her songs were her shield, her secret, and her defiance. Each note carried pain she did not speak, a longing for a world that had never been kind to her. One night, during the blood moon convocation, the court gathered under banners that gleamed like rubies in torchlight. The nobles were adorned in silks and furs, their jewels clinking as they drank, laughed, and whispered of intrigues. Lyra was brought forth, trembling, wrapped in a gown too fine for her small frame. Her hands brushed the floor as she moved forward, feeling the cold marble beneath her fingers. The nobles circled her, eager to see how far they could bend her, how much of her sorrow they could turn into entertainment. "Sing for us, little shadow," one lord sneered. "Make your pain sweeter, make us laugh." Lyra's lips parted and a soft melody emerged. At first the notes were hesitant like a bird testing the wind, but soon they grew strong, deep, and haunting. Her song spoke of forgotten forests, of snow-laden nights where the wind carried whispers of ghosts, and of a loneliness so profound it could crack stone. The nobles gasped, expecting faltering notes, yet they heard truth, not weakness. "Sing louder," another demanded. "Cry for us, blind girl. Cry so we may see what you feel." Lyra obeyed, not because she was afraid, but because she had learned long ago that obeying could hold power of its own. Her voice rose and fell, painting sorrow in the air like smoke from a dying fire. And as she sang, the torches flickered. Shadows danced strangely across the walls. Whispers of something ancient stirred in the palace stones, though no one but Lyra noticed. At the far end of the hall, seated upon the obsidian throne, was the king of Velmora, Kalan, the Alpha King feared across kingdoms. Once a warrior of unmatched strength, Kalan had been struck by a curse in battle 5 winters ago. The curse stole his ability to stand for long, leaving him seated still and silent for nearly half a decade. Few had seen him rise since, and fewer dared hope it could ever happen. He had watched Lyra's performances in silence, cloaked in shadows, his pale eyes studying her every movement. There was something in her song that stirred something long buried within him, a memory of power, of fire, of life itself. Her sorrow was not mockery. It was not meant for him, yet it reached him, clawed at the chains that bound his body, and tugged at the remnants of his spirit. As the nobles demanded more, louder, sadder, more dramatic, Lyra's voice rose like the wind over frozen peaks. The notes carried magic she had never intended to wield, magic that had been sealed inside her from birth. The melody touched the palace itself. threading through the stone and glass, stirring the dust in corners where sunlight had never reached. Kalen's hands, once still and helpless, trembled as if pulled by an invisible current. A faint light glimmered in the throne's ancient sigil, carved in the shape of a wolf with eyes like burning embers. The nobles, intoxicated by wine and cruelty, did not notice. They laughed and jeered at Lyra, oblivious to the slow, inevitable change that was about to unfold. Lyra's final note fell, trembling and raw, echoing against the high ceilings. The hall seemed to hold its breath. A strange hum vibrated through the walls. Then, in a movement that made the room gasp and the air shiver, the Alpha King rose to his feet. For a moment, there was silence so profound it pressed against the ears. The nobles froze, their smugness drained by fear. Wine glasses slipped from trembling hands. Servants and guards alike stared, mouths agape. Kalen, the man who had not walked in years, now stood fully upright, his presence radiating strength, authority, and something terrifyingly beautiful. His eyes, sharp and cold, found Lyra in the center of the hall. "Bring the blind singer to me alone," he commanded, his voice deep, resonant, shaking the foundations of the hall. Lyra's heart raced. She could feel the pulse of power emanating from him, a living storm in human form. The court scrambled, whispering accusations and fear. Some suspected witchcraft. Others murmured about the curse awakening. But no one dared disobey the king now, and no one dared approach him. Guards led Lyra through a labyrinth of corridors, away from the mocking laughter, away from the hall that had tormented her for years. She had no idea what awaited her. Would he punish her, reward her, or was it her song alone that had pulled him from the chains of his curse? Each step she took, she felt the weight of expectation and the stirrings of something more, a connection that neither fear nor cruelty could sever. She was brought before him in the obsidian chamber, a room vast and cold, lined with obsidian mirrors that reflected her own image back at her. Only the king and those of highest rank ever entered this room. For the first time in her life, Lyra felt seen, truly seen. The Alpha King did not look at her as a servant, as a game, or as someone to be ridiculed. He looked at her as though she were a key, a mystery, and perhaps the only thing that could undo the years of darkness that had bound him. Kalen did not speak immediately. He studied her, each gesture and movement, each small breath she drew. It was as if he were memorizing a language he had never known, the language of someone who lived in shadows yet carried light inside them. His gaze was intense, unyielding, yet not cruel. It was a presence that demanded acknowledgement, respect, and somehow understanding. "Your voice," he said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "It is not mere singing, it awakens what has been bound." Lyra's throat tightened. She had never imagined that her songs carried more than beauty or sorrow. She had never dreamed that her voice could move mountains or kings. She felt an unfamiliar power pulse within her, raw and terrifying. And as the Alpha King stepped closer, she realized that she was no longer just a servant of song. She was now a player in a game far greater than she had ever known. Kalen reached out, his hand hovering inches from hers. "Do you understand?" he asked softly. "Do you know what you have done?" Lyra shook her head, fear and awe mixing in her chest. She had only sung, only done what she had always done, yet the consequences were far beyond her comprehension. She could feel destiny pressing against her, reshaping her life in ways she could not yet see. "You will sing for me," Kalen said, his tone shifting from command to something else, something that felt almost like need. "Not for them, not for the court, but for me. Alone." Lyra's mind raced. She did not know if she could obey if she wanted to, or if she even had a choice. But she did know one thing: the world had shifted. The king had risen, and with his rise, her life, her song, and perhaps even her very being had changed forever. Outside the chamber, the hall still murmured with fear and speculation. The nobles whispered about curses, about prophecies, about powers they could not understand. But Lyra and Kaelin stood together in the obsidian chamber, the first spark of an unspoken bond igniting between them. A bond forged not by choice, but by fate, and by a song that was older than memory itself. As Lyra's fingers brushed against the cold obsidian floor, and Kaelin's eyes held hers, the shadows of the room seemed to shift. Something ancient, something powerful, stirred in the air, a presence that had been waiting for centuries to be awakened. And in that moment, Lyra realized that her life of invisibility, of mockery, of silence, was over. The king had risen, and the world would never be the same. Lyra had never been alone with anyone in the palace who held such power. The obsidian chamber seemed colder than the hall outside, yet she felt a warmth in the air that was unlike anything she had known, a presence that drew her forward, though her steps faltered on the polished floor. King Kaelin's gaze did not waver. It held her, measured her, and seemed to weigh not just her form but her very spirit. "You do not understand the force you carry," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Your song, it touches the bindings placed upon me. It calls to them. It makes the chains weaken." Lyra felt a shiver that was not cold. She had sung as she always did, to survive, to cope, to hide herself behind sound. Yet the effect on the Alpha King was undeniable. Something deep within him had stirred, a power long thought lost. I only sing," she whispered. "I do not know what I am doing." He stepped closer, careful not to overwhelm her, yet every movement radiated strength. "No one knows until it is needed. You were born for this, Lyra. That is no mistake." Her name on his lips struck her with a strange force. It was the first time anyone of true power had ever said it aloud, untainted by mockery or command. And for a moment, she could feel the distance between servant and king shrink. The court outside did not understand. Nobles who had once laughed at her now whispered in confusion and fear. Rumors spread faster than fire. Some believed she was a witch, some that she had stolen the king's soul with her voice. Others whispered that she was chosen by the moon itself, a force of fate that could shift the balance of power in Velmora. Lyra knew none of these truths yet, though her heart sensed them. Something ancient slept within her, a thread woven into her life from the day she was abandoned at the palace gates. Her blindness, her isolation, and her songs had all been preparation. She did not yet know why, but she felt a weight pressing on her chest, a calling she could not ignore. Kaelin moved around the chamber with more confidence than he had shown in years. Each step was measured, deliberate, but unsteady enough to remind her of the curse that had once bound him. "You may not see the danger, Lyra," he said, "but it surrounds you. Every noble who sneered at you tonight, they will not forgive what has happened. They will not forgive that I have risen." Lyra's fingers traced the edge of the obsidian floor. She had felt fear before, but never like this, a fear not for herself, but for what the future could bring. She sensed the currents of power shifting around them, fragile yet immense. "Why me?" she asked. "Why my voice?" He knelt, lowering himself to her level, as if to show that the king who had risen was still, somehow, a man who could bend to her understanding. "Your voice is old magic, Lyra," he explained. "It is moonbound, the kind that is born once in an age. It has the power to heal, to awaken, or to destroy. The moment I heard it, the chains that held me began to break, but it is not yet complete, and it is not yet safe." Lyra swallowed. She had sung to live, sung to hide, sung to be ignored. But the king's words made her realize that she had sung into something far larger, something that had always waited for her. She had been born into a story she did not yet understand, a story of power, of destiny, and of choices that could shape kingdoms. "You will remain close to me," Kaelin continued, "until we understand it. You will not be mocked again, not under my gaze. No one will touch you, and no one will laugh at your song." Lyra felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. She had spent her life hiding, yet now she was being drawn into a world where her voice mattered more than her blindness, more than her status as a servant. The court had made her a spectacle. Now she was a key. Outside, the whispers grew louder. Courtiers debated whether the king's rising was a miracle, a curse, or a portent of doom. The queen mother demanded explanations, and the nobles who had mocked Lyra looked on with envy and fear. Yet within the palace, behind the heavy doors of the obsidian chamber, none of that mattered. Here, Lyra was no longer an invisible girl. She was seen, understood, and in a sense chosen. The king walked slowly, testing the strength that had once been denied him. Lyra watched each step, marveling at the ease with which he carried himself. She had only imagined kings as distant, untouchable figures. But now, seeing him rise, she realized that he was still human, powerful, yes, but human and bound by the same fears and pains as any other. "You have changed the course of my life," he said quietly, "and perhaps the fate of this kingdom, but it is only the beginning." The days that followed were unlike any Lyra had ever known. Guards and servants who once ignored her now whispered in reverence. Nobles no longer mocked, they avoided her gaze. And yet, even in her new place of safety, attention grew. She felt the eyes of the court upon her constantly, measuring her, questioning her worth. Some plotted in silence, seeking to undo what she had done, to remove the girl who had awakened the king from the chains of his curse. But Lyra did not sing for the court. She sang for the king. Each evening, she would enter the obsidian chamber, and her songs would flow into the cold stone halls, reaching him where he stood or moved with more strength than before. And with each note, the king regained a little more of himself, a step, a lift of his head, a deepening of his gaze. Their bond grew quietly, in moments of silence as much as in words. Lyra taught him how to feel again, how to trust instincts that had lain dormant for years. Kaelan guided her through corridors, showing her places she had never dared to enter alone, protecting her with a fierce intensity that was both frightening and comforting. Neither spoke of what they were becoming, but both sensed it, a connection forged in magic, pain, and the unspoken understanding that neither could return to the lives they had led before. One evening, Lyra felt a tremor in the floor beneath her as she sang. She had reached a high, sustained note, and the obsidian mirrors along the chamber walls began to shimmer, reflecting not just her form but shadows of things she could not name. The king approached, hands steady, but eyes wide with concern. "You are awakening something that sleeps beneath the kingdom," he said, "something that has waited for your voice." Lyra shivered. The thought that her songs could awaken more than magic, that they could stir forces older than the palace itself, was terrifying. And yet it filled her with a strange sense of purpose. She was no longer merely surviving. She was part of something greater, something that demanded courage she had never known she possessed. Days passed, and tensions in the court grew. The queen mother, ever watchful, demanded that Lyra be dismissed, claiming that the girl's presence was unnatural, that her songs had disturbed the balance of the palace. The nobles who had once laughed at her openly plotted to find ways to discredit her, to prove that she was unworthy of the king's attention. But Kaelan stood firm. "No one will harm her," he declared. "She is mine to protect, and the kingdom will learn respect through fear if necessary." Lyra realized that her life had shifted completely. She had gone from a girl mocked and ignored to a figure central to the survival of a king, and perhaps a kingdom. The weight of her destiny pressed upon her, heavy and relentless. But it was a weight she could bear, for the first time not with fear but with resolve. One night, as the moon rose high and the palace slept under a blanket of frost, Lyra sang quietly to herself. Her voice echoed softly through the empty corridors, carrying with it the sorrow, hope, and power that had always lived within her. She did not yet know the full extent of what she could do, but she could feel it, the ancient magic that was her birthright, the song that had awakened a king, and the destiny that now stretched before her like a path of ice and fire. And in the shadow of the obsidian chamber the king stood, listening, his eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. He had risen once because of her song, and he would walk again, fully, only with her by his side. But the court outside was not silent. The nobles whispered of danger, betrayal, and curses. They plotted in shadowed corners, unaware that the true power now rested not with titles or swords, but with a blind Omega whose voice had become the key to the king's freedom. As Lyra finished her song, she felt a tremor within herself, a stirring of something older than memory, something waiting to be awakened. And when she turned, guided by instinct rather than sight, she found the king watching her, a question in his eyes that even she could feel without words. "Do you know what you have started?" he asked softly, his voice carrying across the cold floor. Lyra swallowed. She did not. And yet, somewhere deep within, she knew that nothing could ever return to what it had been. The palace of Velmora had never seemed so alive, or so dangerous. Ever since King Kaelan had risen from his throne, the corridors hummed with whispers, suspicion, and fear. The nobles who had once mocked Lyra now studied her with careful, calculating eyes. Some bowed to her with forced respect, others avoided her entirely, but Lyra paid little mind to the gossip. Her focus had shifted to the king, and the strange, urgent magic that flowed between them. Kaelan had regained much of his strength, yet every step he took reminded him of the curse that had once bound him. He walked with grace now, but it was careful and deliberate, as though each movement measured a balance between power and restraint. He still needed Lyra's songs. Each note she sang carried a warmth and energy that soothed the lingering shadows within him, gave him clarity of mind, and even eased the ache that had plagued him for years. One morning, Lyra awoke to the sound of faint chanting drifting from beneath the palace. She followed it instinctively, guided by the resonance in her chest that she had always known but never understood. The sound led her to a hidden chamber, sealed with runes older than the palace itself. There she found ancient scrolls stacked in stone alcoves, their leather covers cracked with age and silver ink shimmering faintly under the torchlight. Kaelan appeared behind her, moving silently. "These are the records of the Moonbound," he said. "They speak of the bond between an Alpha King and the Omega who carries the Moonbound magic. You are that Omega, Lyra. That is why you are here, and why your song awakened me." Lyra's fingers brushed the scrolls, feeling the faint hum of magic beneath the ink. She had been born blind, yet the runes vibrated under her touch as if recognizing her presence. Her heart raced. "What does it mean?" she asked. "Why was I abandoned, and why do I carry this power?" Kaelan knelt beside her, eyes steady and serious. "Long ago, in the battles that shaped Velmora, I fought an Alpha Queen from the Shadow North. She was not only powerful but cursed, and she bound me with her dying breath. That curse is what kept me chained, what made me unable to rise. The Moonbound Omega, the one with your song, was the key to breaking it. That Omega is born once in an age, and that is you." Lyra's mind spun. All her life she had been mocked, ignored, and ridiculed. And now the truth was revealed. Her blindness, her isolation, her voice, and her very being had been chosen for a purpose she could barely comprehend. The weight of it pressed on her chest like the frost outside, yet it also filled her with a strange pride. She was no longer powerless. She was central to the fate of the king and perhaps of the kingdom itself. "Does this mean I can heal you completely?" she asked, fear and hope battling in her chest. "Yes," Kaelan said, "but it is not simple. The curse is older than me, older than the kingdom. To break it, the magic must be awakened fully. And doing so is dangerous. It could harm you, or worse, it could destroy what remains of me if uncontrolled." Lyra felt her heart tighten. She had always believed that her song was merely a comfort, a distraction from the cruelty of the court. Now, it was something far greater, a power that could heal or destroy, depending on how she wielded it. She realized for the first time that every note she had sung, every melody that had escaped her lips in the hall of mockery, had been a thread pulling her toward this moment. Days turned into weeks as Lyra began to practice under Kaelin's guidance. She sang not for the court, not for amusement, but with purpose. Each note carried intention, each melody deliberate. She discovered that her songs could stir emotions, awaken memories, and even manipulate energy in ways that seemed impossible. With each session, the king grew stronger, standing taller, walking farther, and regaining a confidence that had been buried for years. But their bond did not go unnoticed. The Queen Mother grew increasingly suspicious, demanding explanations for the king's sudden recovery and the girl who had once been invisible. She whispered to the nobles that Lyra was dangerous, that her magic could bring ruin to the throne, and that she must be removed before she gained full control. One evening, during a private session, Lyra sang a melody that carried both sorrow and strength, the notes weaving through the chamber like threads of silver. The king closed his eyes, letting the sound guide him, and for a moment they existed in a world outside the palace, outside fear and politics, where only trust and magic held meaning. Then, without warning, the chamber trembled. The mirrors along the walls shimmered and rippled as if alive. Shadows twisted unnaturally, forming shapes that were not human. Lyra stopped singing, heart pounding. "The curse, it reacts to your full voice," Kaelin said, his tone tense. "It is aware of your power. You are awakening what was meant to remain dormant." Lyra swallowed. She had never imagined that her songs could reach beyond the king, beyond the palace, beyond even time itself. And yet, here it was, an ancient presence stirring because of her. Fear gripped her, but it was accompanied by determination. She had never been able to choose her life, but now she could choose how to wield her voice. The following days brought more challenges. Nobles who had once scorned her plotted in secret. A messenger arrived from the northern territories, carrying warnings of unrest, strange creatures seen at the edges of the kingdom, and rumors of a shadow wolf moving through the forests at night. Lyra realized that the awakening of her magic might not only heal the king, but could also attract dangers they could not yet understand. Kaelin watched her closely, recognizing the strain in her posture, the tension in her voice. "You are not alone in this," he said gently. "We face it together. You do not have to carry this burden alone." Lyra felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had lived in a world where she was ignored, belittled, and mocked. And yet here was the king, powerful and feared by all, offering her not protection alone but partnership. For the first time she felt seen, valued, and capable. Yet even as she learned to control her gift, the shadows of Velmora stirred. One night she was summoned to the court under the guise of a feast. The nobles watched her with sharp eyes, waiting to see if she could fail, waiting for the moment to strike. Lyra's heart raced, but she stood tall, guided by the king's quiet presence behind her. They demanded a song, not her usual melodies, but a song that would display obedience, humility, and charm. Lyra understood immediately what they were testing. She closed her eyes, and instead of bending to mockery, she sang a melody that carried subtle power. The notes were soft but firm, weaving strength beneath the beauty, and the nobles felt it, a force beneath the sound that could not be ignored. Whispers ran through the hall. Some bowed, some stepped back, others scowled. No one dared mock her. Her song had become more than melody, it was influence, subtle and undeniable. And at the far end of the hall, Kaelin watched her, a quiet pride in his eyes. But the moment of triumph was brief. In the shadows, a figure observed, a court mage loyal to the Queen Mother, whose whispers had poisoned the ears of the nobles. He had recognized the true nature of Lyra's power and plotted to exploit it. The mage's eyes glowed faintly with anticipation, for he knew that if Lyra's magic was fully awakened without guidance, the consequences could be catastrophic. Lyra finished her song and bowed lightly. She could feel the king's gaze upon her, steady and protective. Yet a chill ran through her. The court was not safe, and the forces gathering outside the palace walls were growing restless. Something was coming, something that would test the limits of her power and the strength of the bond she shared with the king. Later, in the quiet of the obsidian chamber, Lyra confided her fears to Kaelan. "I do not know if I can control it," she whispered. "What if my voice, my magic hurts you or the kingdom?" He reached out, placing a hand over hers. "Then we learn together," he said. "The world has waited long enough for your voice. We cannot hide from it, but we can face it side by side." Lyra nodded, feeling a courage she had never known. Her life had been one of shadows, mockery, and loneliness. Now she carried purpose, power, and a bond that was unbreakable. She was the moonbound Omega, and her song would shape the destiny of Velmora, for good or ill, she did not yet know. The night stretched long, and as the moonlight spilled across the chamber, Lyra sang softly to herself. The king listened quietly, his presence steady and reassuring. Outside, in the halls of the palace, whispers of fear and admiration mingled, for everyone knew that something extraordinary had awakened. The blind Omega had become the center of a story far larger than herself, a story of power, magic, and destiny intertwined with the Alpha King who now walked again. Winter had begun its slow retreat in Velmora, though the kingdom remained cloaked in ice and shadow. The palace corridors echoed with whispers, some fearful, some reverent, as the nobles debated the rising power of the moonbound Omega. Lyra moved through these halls with a confidence she had never known. Her blindness no longer defined her. Her voice, her presence, and the growing magic within her did. King Kaelan walked beside her, fully restored in strength and stride, yet carrying the weight of the past years in the measured way he held himself. The curse that had bound him to the throne for 5 winters had not been entirely broken. Instead, it lingered as a fragile tether, a reminder of the danger that still clung to their fates. Lyra and Kaelan had spent weeks deciphering ancient texts, learning the rituals, and understanding the prophecy that bound them. The moonbound Omega and the Alpha King were part of a cycle older than memory itself. It had been foretold that only the union of voice and strength, courage and will, could shatter the shadow that haunted Velmora. The final step required the battlefield where the curse had begun, the frozen plains of the Shadow North. There, under the eclipse of the blood moon, the ritual had to be performed. The air would be thick with magic, and the forces that had slept beneath the kingdom would awaken to test them both. As they prepared to leave, the Queen Mother confronted them. Her expression was a mixture of fear, anger, and desperation. "Do you truly understand what you are doing?" she demanded. "If you fail, you will doom not only yourselves but the kingdom. This power is beyond both of you." Kaelan's eyes, bright and steady, met hers. "I have already walked through death once. I will not fear it again. And this Omega," he said, gesturing to Lyra, "will not fail. She carries the moonbound magic, and together we will see this through." Lyra bowed her head slightly, feeling the weight of expectation settle upon her shoulders. Fear whispered in her mind, but so did determination. She had been mocked, abandoned, and ignored. Now she would not hide. She would not falter. She would face what had been waiting for her since birth. The journey to the Shadow North was treacherous. Snowstorms raged across the plains, and the wind howled like wolves in the distance. Lyra's voice, soft yet strong, carried through the blizzard, guiding them both and keeping the magic flowing. Each note she sang seemed to bend the snow around them, opening a path through the frozen wilderness. At night, as they huddled beside dying fires, Kaelan spoke of his past battles and losses. He told Lyra of the Alpha Queen who had cursed him, of the soldiers who had fallen, and of the endless winters he had endured in silence. In turn, Lyra shared her own memories of being abandoned, of being mocked, and of learning to survive through song and instinct. Their voices wove together, blending sorrow, hope, and a growing bond that neither words nor sight could fully capture. When they finally reached the battlefield, the sky above was dark and heavy, the blood moon casting a crimson glow over the frozen earth. The shadows seemed to move with intent, stretching and twisting as if alive. Lyra could feel the magic thrumming beneath her feet, responding to her presence and the rhythm of her heart. Kalen took her hand, grounding her in the storm. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Lyra nodded, closing her eyes. She had never needed to see to understand what lay ahead. She had felt it in the tremor of the ground, in the pull of the wind, and in the steady heartbeat of the king beside her. They began the ritual. Lyra's voice rose, clear and commanding, carrying the moonbound magic through the frozen battlefield. Kalen chanted the words of release, grounding the energy and guiding it through the sigils etched into the snow and ice. The wind responded, swirling in silver spirals, lifting snow into the air like living mist. The shadow of the Alpha Queen appeared, immense and terrifying, a colossal wolf formed of darkness and rage. Her eyes glowed like burning coals and her voice rolled across the plains like thunder. "The curse is eternal," she growled. "No Omega can undo what I have bound." Lyra did not falter. Her voice became stronger, richer, and more commanding. Each note carried her will, her courage, and her love, not just for the king, but for the world she wished to protect. The shadow wolf lunged, and the ground shook with its power. Kalen met it head-on, his strength amplified by Lyra's song, holding the ritual together even as the darkness threatened to consume them. The clash was immense. Magic and shadow collided, sending sparks of light across the snow. Lyra felt the energy pulling at her, testing her, trying to bend her will. Pain shot through her chest, yet she sang louder, pouring every ounce of determination into her voice. She could feel the bond with the king, strong and unwavering, carrying them through the storm. And then, at the climax of the ritual, Lyra's voice reached a note so pure, so full of intention, that it struck the heart of the shadow wolf. The darkness shuddered, twisted, and began to unravel. The curse that had bound Kalen, that had haunted Velmora for years, shattered into silver mist, dissolving under the power of her song. Kalen fell to one knee, exhausted but free. The shadows dissipated, leaving only the snow and the crimson glow of the blood moon. Lyra's voice softened, the magic settling within her, no longer a burden but a gift, a power she had learned to wield with care and wisdom. The king rose fully, stronger than ever, and looked at Lyra with a mix of awe and gratitude. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me and the kingdom." Lyra shook her head slightly, tears freezing on her cheeks. "We did it," she corrected, "together." The journey back to Velmora was quiet, yet full of unspoken understanding. The court had watched the blood moon rise, felt the shift in the magic, and realized that the moonbound Omega had fulfilled her destiny. The nobles who had plotted against her fell silent, fear and respect mingling in their expressions. The Queen Mother, though still wary, could not deny the bond between Lyra and the king, nor the miracle that had occurred. Back in the palace, Lyra was no longer a servant, no longer a figure to be mocked. She stood beside the king as an equal, her presence commanding respect and awe. The corridors that had once been cold and lonely now felt alive, filled with whispers of hope, magic, and change. On the night following their return, under a sky full of stars, Kalen and Lyra stood on the palace balcony. The moonlight reflected on the frozen gardens, and the air was filled with a quiet peace that had not been felt in years. "What does the world look like now?" Kalen asked softly, turning to her. "Now that the curse is broken and the kingdom is safe." Lyra smiled, lifting her face to the light she had never needed to see to feel. "Brighter," she said, her voice gentle yet firm. "Brighter because we stand together, not above or below, but side by side." The king took her hand, holding it with a strength that was not about power or dominance, but trust and partnership. "Then let this kingdom know," he said, "that power is not in birth, nor in fear, but in courage, wisdom, and choice, and that the moonbound Omega has the right to be seen, heard, and honored." Lyra nodded, feeling a joy she had never imagined. She had been mocked, abandoned, and underestimated. But now she was no longer invisible. She had sung to survive, to heal, and finally to change the fate of a king, a kingdom, and herself. And in the distance, the mountains of Velmora seemed to shimmer, as if acknowledging the new age. The shadows that had lingered for centuries were gone, replaced by light, hope, and a promise that the world could be reshaped by courage and song. The palace was quiet, yet full of possibilities. And for the first time, Lyra realized that this was only the beginning. Her voice, her power, and her bond with the king had opened a path not just for survival, but for transformation for herself, for Kaelin, and for all of Velmora. The moon shone bright over the kingdom, casting twin lights across the palace towers. And somewhere in the distant forests and hills, ancient forces stirred, watching, waiting, yet now aware that a new age had begun. Lyra and Kaelin stood together, hands intertwined, hearts aligned, and destinies bound. The moonbound Omega had awoken. The Alpha King had risen fully, and the world would never be the same.